Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Maria Reitz. I'm one of the curators of the project Yiddishland Pavilion, together with artist Evgeny Fix. We've started this alternative pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which is not a regular pavilion. It's the first transnational independent pavilion that focuses on various Jewish and Yiddish narratives, events, Jewish and Yiddish culture. And Yiddishland Pavilion is representing Yiddishland at the Venice Biennale, which is a totally guerrilla project. So we kind of imposed ourselves on the map of the Biennale, trying to also see what would be the mechanisms of challenging the national division, the kind of pavilion system that is as old as the Biennale is, because the national division has always been at the very core of the Biennale structure. So we were thinking what would be the way to, challenge the structure, to see how the questions of national division can be turned into transnational collectivity, of transnational gathering, of transnational exchange, and so on. Going back to tonight's event, final event of Yiddishland Pavilion, I'm very happy that this is this event. It's a collective event bringing together lots of people, lots of voices, lots of languages. The event is called Performing Blackouts, and it's an orchestrated reading by our artist, Ofri Lapid, that has put together, I think, a very interesting selection of texts and poems and thoughts and concepts that we're going to discuss a little later today. And the event is based on kind of reanimating of censored texts that have been censored in different countries, mostly in Germany and in Israel, due to various reasons, mostly political. This is how censorship usually works. And Ofri will tell more about the concept of the event, but I would just like to introduce her. Ofri is an artist born in Haifa. She is also a PhD candidate at the School of Visual Arts in Hamburg. Her work concerns the composition, activation, and dissolution of private, scholarly, and independent archives. Her manner of working is based on site-specific and collaborative practices, which often provide her the basis for installation of objects, photographs, and videos. Additionally, she develops a series of orchestrated lecture performances and events, and they combine oral narrations, field recordings, and objects, and function both within academic conference settings and in exhibition spaces. She exhibited in various venues globally, and her latest publication was featured in Archive Dekolonisieren, Translators Verlag in 2018. And we're very happy to welcome Ofri tonight, and very happy that this event is premiering at the Yiddishland Pavilion. So Ofri, the floor is yours. Please take over.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much for this introduction. It's also quite amazing to see what kind of way the Yiddish Pavilion has made in the last few months. I'm very happy for this invitation as well. I will tell a little bit about the idea for the project and how it came about, and introduce you to the speakers of tonight. When I first was approaching the idea of creating an event for the Yiddish Pavilion, I came across a book that was dedicated to the Yiddish theater scene in early 20th century in Berlin, in the Scheunenviertel where I live. I found one fact in the book that was very, very fascinating, and that most of at the time in the 20th century, most of the theater plays had to be submitted for censorship by the German police, by the Theaterpolizei. And with the Yiddish theater, which at the time was very, very had quite of a flourishing, it was a flourishing scene in Berlin. They had to translate the text into German in order for the censors to actually understand them. Sprengel, the author of this book, has mentioned that even though certain sections or sentences were crossed out from the plays, from the manuscripts that were handed out, the Yiddish actors still found ways to undermine censorship by implementing word plays and double entendres. So this idea of Yiddish becoming subversive and the kind of gaps between what is admitted to be said and what is actually been played on stage brought me to think of Yiddish as a space for radical expression, a place of subversion, and a place for freedom of speech. I then came up with this unusual idea to apply it to a much more recent history, the history of censorship in Israel, and to ask or examine what happens if Yiddish can reclaim this kind of radical position through the translation of censored Hebrew and Arabic texts. So in Israel, there was actually a department called the Council of Censorship of Films and Plays that was in charge on reviewing and censoring plays and films from the year 1927, the time mandatory Palestine, till in a way recently in history, until the 1991. Although having at the moment less to do with theater, because it's now basically not reviewing theater anymore, the council still operates in regard to public distribution of films. Yet we can still speak, I think, about an unofficial modes of censorship, but a discussion we can perhaps later on begin, and that's still taking effect somehow in Israel, and we can see different examples in which theater shows are being cancelled, or there's because of some political pressure, or that there are prevention of budgets. And for today's reading, I chose several excerpts from texts that were censored in Israel, in both in official and non-official manner, from 1960s till present time. So it's a rather large scope of time of different excerpts, and they kind of are weaved into each other and to create like a facade of censorship examples. The text, what is kind of unusual in this program, is all the texts were translated especially for this event from Hebrew or Arabic to Yiddish, and they're going to be also read mostly by the translators of the texts. And the last text is quite unusual. It's a text that was one text that was from a play from Germany that was censored, and I will introduce it afterwards. So the first passage we are going to listen to is from a play by the Israeli dramatist Hanoch Levin. God bless you wherever you are. The play titled The Patriot is a satirical cabaret written in 1982 as a response to the First Israel-Lebanon War. The play was rejected by the Israeli censors. After an appeal was filed, the play was allowed to be performed. Nevertheless, 3 sections were crossed out from the play and prevented to be shown. We will hear one of these sections translated to Yiddish from Hebrew and read by Irad Ben Isaac. And after Irad, we will hear an excerpt from the play Basic Instinct, which was directed by Yael Tal and co-created by Anat Dreamer and Amar Redler. The play was written and performed recently in 2021. I don't know if Yael is here in the audience, but I invited her. It is a satirical but heartfelt montage of narratives based on the testimonies of female soldiers who served in the Palestinian territories. It was performed in various venues in Israel, but following a complaint of the conservative organization Betzalmo, a performance in Be'er Sheva Theater was cancelled. The excerpt we're going to hear is a soldier's testimony chosen especially for this evening by the director Yael Tal and translated to Yiddish by Elena Hoffenberg. Eliana Jacobs will be reading us the text. I just want to say before we start that I'm going to share my screen with English captions for those who don't understand the Yiddish, but you are welcome also to listen to the Yiddish. I hope I will do it justice. So just a second. Yes, Irad, you may begin.
Thank you, Fri. Und der Patriot bei Hanoch Levin. Sicherheit-Anweisungen für die besetzten Gebieten. Gouvernator. Bruchim aboim zum Gouvernatorhaus von Beis Jarjur. Sicherheit-Anweisungen. Geht ein Mensch auf den Gas und beguckt sich herum, Nervösheit, in die Seiten und nach hinten. Soll man choschet sein, als ist ein Araber, ein Terrorist. Geht ein Mensch auf den Gas und guckt vorwärts mit Stillkeit und Naches, soll man choschet sein, als ist ein Araber, ein Terrorist, ein Kaltblutiger. Geht ein Mensch auf den Gas und guckt herunter zum Trottoir, soll man choschet sein, als ist ein Araber, ein Terrorist, ein Introvert. Geht ein Mensch auf den Gas mit vermachten Augen, soll man choschet sein, als ist ein Araber, ein Terrorist, ein Schlufferig. Geht ein Mensch auf den Gas gar nicht, soll man choschet sein, als ist ein Araber, ein Terrorist, ein Kranker. All die Dosike als solche Chashudim soll man arrestieren. In dem Fall, als man prüft wegläufen, soll man schießen in der Luft eine Warnung. Dem Toten nimmt man zum Pathologischen Institut. Thank you.
Eliana, it's okay.
A chulem hab ich gechulemt. Nomen 3 Stern. Einheit Nachal, Ort Chevron. Den Unteroffizieren hab ich geschlafen mit der Rote in der Einrichtung in Chevron. Zu lieb dem, was es nicht kein Ort von Mädlich, hab ich geschlafen in einem Zimmer mit Jünglich. Und ich gedenkt wie eine Nacht, 4 Säger Tag, ist gekommen einer von die Kommandieren von einem Abteil. Ein Sergeant dachte sich. Und hat sich gesetzt auf mein Bett und hat mich abgeweckt. Ich habe Arier getan, hat sich gesetzt mit einem Keulenschutzwestel, mit einem Kiewer, mit einem Gewehr und Punkt, wenn sich ein bisschen errappt von der Wach, ich frage ihn, was ist geschehen? Und ist gesessen, so vergläsert und hat mir gesagt, Chulem hab ich gechulemt. Hab ich ihm gefragt, was für ein Chulem? Ich hab gechulemt, als Jiden schlagen mir und Araber schlagen mir und ständig inmitten hab ich keine Sache nicht gekannt. Dann hab ich mir Frage getan. Es ist nicht gewesen kein Chulem, ist ein bisschen ein Rapp von der Wach und etwas ist geschehen. Und hat gesagt, ja. Ich hab mamisch sich genötigt, der Zellner ist gewinn übergerascht. Sie haben nur was herausgesetzt, Besetzers, was seinen hereingegangenen Kromen von Palästina in Hebron. Die Palästiner sind gekommen zu beschützen die Kromen. Die Besetzers haben geprüft, hereinzugehen mit Gewalt. Die Zellner sind dorten gewinnen mitten und haben gekriegen geschlagen von beiden. Und der Zellner ist poschet gewinn abgerudert. Ich habe mamisch gemusst ihm helfen, sich auszutun. Auszutun sich von dem Kiewer, von dem Whistel, zu liegen, sich schlafen, zu vergessen und dann. Er ist zurückgekommen, überrascht von der Situation. Es ist euch eine von den Sachen, was ist geblieben mit mir als euch gut.
Thank you, Irad, and thank you, Eliana. Next, we are going to listen to two poems. The first poem is by Samih al-Qasim. He is a famous Palestinian poet whose 1969 poetry collection title, "And It Was Because of the Thunderbird Will Come," led to his arrest on suspicion of inciting rebellion by the Israeli authorities. In May 1978, one of his poems was censored from the Hebrew magazine Ariel, and in protest of this, the poets Dalia Rebikovic, Yehuda Amichai, and Meir Wieselter demanded that their poems will be cut from the booklet as well. The poem I've chosen from his collection was translated into Yiddish from Arabic by Ethel Niborsky, and will also be read by her. The second poem we are going to hear was written by the author, poet, and researcher Sigal Naor Perelman. It was written in May 2021, after the recent Gaza-Israel attack. The poem was dismissed by a major literary publication, although it was first accepted to be published without providing any plausible explanation. The poem will be soon seen in print in Perelman's forthcoming book, Bonam Tzirua, published by Pardes. I think we are very lucky to have Sigal here in the Zoom audience, I hope. And we will, perhaps you could also tell us later in the end of the event about her experience while writing it and publishing it. The poem was translated from Hebrew to Yiddish by Shiri Shapira and would also be read by her. So I welcome both Ethel and Shiri.
Sofu Nashmues Mitatafsen, Samih el-Qasim. Durch der schmoller Sparune von mein Kammer seh ich beimer schmeicheln zu mir. Dächer ungefüllt mit meinike und Fenster, was weinen und beten vor mir. Durch der schmoller Sparune von mein Kammer seh ich dein Kammer, die Größe.
הטורם zum Vertiliken. Beim Bregjam, a Scheiner und a Schmoller, in einem Quartal, was heißt Arimal, steht a Turem a Heucher. Und wer wohnt in dem Turem? Auf den 13. Gorn, die Mischpoche al-Kaulak. Auf den 12. Gorn, die Mischpoche al-Kaulak. Auf den 11. Gorn, die Mischpoche al-Kaulak. Auf den 10. Gorn, die Mischpoche al-Kaulak. Auf den 9. Gorn, die Mischpoche al-Kaulak. Auf den 8. Gorn, die Mischpoche Ishkantana. Auf den 7. Gorn, die Mischpoche Ishkantana. Auf den 6. Gorn, die Mischpoche Abu al-Auf. Auf den 5. Gorn, die Mischpoche Abu al-Auf. Auf den 4. Gorn, die Mischpoche al-Ifranji. Auf den 3. Gorn, die Mischpoche al-Ifranji. Auf den 2. Gorn, die Mischpoche al-Alawul. Auf den 1. Gorn, die Mischpoche Ude. Von alle Basis kommen Piloten und fliehen herum, schweben wie Adlers. Wie gefallen euch die Stiebel? Sie gefallen uns. Wie gefällt euch die Kirche? Es gefällt uns. Wie gefällt euch der Korridor? Es gefällt uns. Wie gefällt euch das Leben? Es gefällt uns. Im Kein geht weg von dannen. Und azoi, beim Bregjam, a scheiner und a schmoller, is abgemeckt geworden, a Turem a heucher, und zwischen die Churves flattert a Teub, was wolket a ganzen Tag.
Thank you, Ethel, and thank you, Shiri, for this wonderful reading. Now we are going to listen to the last two passages that are a little bit longer. They are taken from both of them from theater plays. The first is from a play titled Friends Talk About Jesus, written by Amos Kenan from 1978. The play, which is considered one of the most subversive that Kenan wrote, as a famous playwright and columnist and artist, was disqualified in 1970 by the Council of Criticism of Play in Israel due to what was defined as an injury to the public's feelings. The play depicts a complex array of topics relevant to Israeli society, I believe also today. It's rather abstract in some ways, from religious identity to relation with Palestinian other to female sexual desires. It's put in, the play puts Jesus as a character in the play that transforms from one character to the other. It was translated to Yiddish by Elena Hoffenberg and will be read to us by Jack Schneider. And the last text we are going to read is quite unique in this selection. I chose to also refer to the beginning of my journey when I reviewed texts that Yiddish plays that were censored in Berlin by the Berlin police. And I've chosen I've chosen to translate this play in the other way around, from the Yiddish to English. The play is called the Schite, the Slaughter, and it was written in 1899 by Yaakov Gordin. I found the manuscript of this play in one of the files of the Berlin Theater Police that are kept in the Landesarchiv in Berlin. A few parts from this play were crossed out by the police, but much emphasis was given to the last monologue spoken by the protagonist, Estherke. Her monologue tells us about her own desires and release from an abusive marriage with the town's butcher. This is the first translation at all, I think, that I could find to English and of this play, or there's no other translation to English by Jake Krakowski. We would hear him reading the original, and you can read his translation in the captions. So I welcome both Jake and Jack to read us. We will start with Amos Kenan.
Amos Kenan, Chaverim Rednaf Yeshu. Man,
Guten Abend.
Roy,
Wo bist du?
Man,
In Mohammed.
Roy,
Siehst du? Sag je etwas.
an alter Man.
Was ist? Ich der Mann sich in die schöne junge Jahren, wenn wir seien nach Reus gegangen zu Krieg mit Gesangen und dann gegen Nacht, nachdem wir haben aufgeschlagen, die Gezelten, pflegen wir kleiben zweiglich und anzünden nach Feirl, singen, gedenken sich und überlegen sich Stillerheit sei, unsere nifter gewordene Chaveren.
Mädel,
Sagt schon mir, wegen der Mohammed, erzählt uns, wie soll der Tag von Schlacht und der Abend von dem Tag haben sich geendigt. Und wie soll die Gefallene seinen Gefallen, erzählt uns wegen dem Herabfall von die Belegerte und wegen dem Tag von der Komme.
Roy,
Efter wird uns erzählen, wegen wie soll ihr verbringt Zeit.
Man.
Also, wir gehen kleiden zweiglich, zünden wir an auf Feier und danach gehen wir suchen einen alten Mann oder eine alte Frau.
Roy.
Was?
Man.
Kidei sie anzuzünden.
Alter Mann.
Das gefällt mir nicht.
Big.
Es ist nicht gefährlich. Es ist noch nur Jugend.
Roy.
Efter kennst du etwas spielen?
Man.
Was wollt ihr hören?
Lemmel.
Efter etwas Treueriges.
Big.
Etwas weit von die Tag.
Man.
Gut.
Mädel.
Ich will sein nach Holm, der offene Käfer, in welchen alle Flüssen von Bagär müssen fließen, a ledige Pust, in welcher der Holm halten fallen und kein Mal nicht der Griechen zum Grund, Schlüsselloch, magisch Fingerl, der Schuch von einer Operasängerin, in welchen der Anhängers Wein ist angegossen, a reut feierdig Zirkel von ausgetrachten Bagär, nass und feucht und heiß und zerflattert und behaart und schmeckendig. Sie wollen tropfen auf mir, alle. Die Neshames wollen herauskommen bis ins Sof, zu zeugen wie ein alten Gied, ein neandertalisch Feilenbeugen, was hat gewahrt a 40.000 Jahr unter dem Eis, nur zerbreckelt sich in letzter Mie. Was für ein Lachen, mein Leben, was für ein Witz. Ich hör, wie sie blosen und brennen, das kranke und kriechendige Blut reißt auf die Euren, sie wollen sterben auf den Strick, a Teut von Hoffnung. Kommt, keine meine, kommt zu Teut. Ich will abtrinken eure letzte Schicht Seere. Durstig bin ich.
Big.
Und dennoch soll ich schneiden dem Strick?
Mädel.
Wie gar nicht. Und ich will absägen dein Kopf und die Hörner und ich will sie montieren auf der Wand.
Alter Mann.
Und ich?
Mädel.
Dich will in die Hintu fassen.
Alter Mann.
Bin ich gerissen zwischen Schreck und Begehr.
Big.
Efter wird der Strick allein sich zerreißen.
Alter Mann.
Efter noch einmal.
Mädel.
Sie wird kommen?
Sie verbindet sie beide mit dem Strick und führt sie und verlässt die Bühne.
Estherkes letzte Monolog von die Schritte von Yankiv Gordon. Was ist das? Mir warft Hand und Fies. Du hörst? Schläft schon. Ein gesunder Mensch und hat nicht was zu sagen. Was kann ich machen, was andere fühlen und was andere leiden? Ui. Sein Choppen ruppet und zuppet. Gleich soll mit der stumpen Messer mir schneiden meine Glieder. Gott in you, es hebt sich ohne Nacht vor mir. Was ist das? Chalofim nur. Von wann haben sich genommen durch Chalofim? Wie kommen daher Chalofim? Das hast mir Stamme Schmuel Jossel vergessen. Wie grob und schlecht ist weggewehen zu ihm. Blut hat von mein Herz getrieft, wenn man hat ihm getrieben. Seine Chalofim. Was habe ich sicher so erschrocken? 'n kalter Schweiß hat mir bedeckt im Stern. Die Chalofen haben mich ständig geschrocken. Still und dunkel. Und ich bin allein. Nein. Die Nacht will ich ab ihm nicht überleben. Oi, sein Schlafen. Ich will mich Sugar werden. Ich kann nicht behalten von ihm. Viele der Reich von seinem Atem stickt mich und wagt mich. Ach. Die Chalofim haben mich ermahnt, wie Shmuel Yossel verlernen. Hakol scheuchtin und schchitasan koschere. Alle mögen keulen und sehr Schritte ist koscher. Alle mögen keulen. Alle mögen keulen. Und nachdem fleckt neben dem größten, scharfen Chalef in Hand. Und bei mir fliegt dann eben zittern das Herz. Und mir fleckt sich auf, es weiß nicht, sehr Blut. Los mich weg von dannen. Nicht moire, Esterke. Zest. Oder so sucht man Pekines. Ein kalter Schein liegt auf ihm. Das ist ein Schatten. Das ist der Schatten von Teut. Sagt, wenn ich darf keulen in Nacht, hab ich Zorris. Guckt auf mir mit größeren, rachmonistigen Augen und ich schneid mit dem scharfen Chalef und das heiße Blut gießt. Und der Tate sagt, was ist Farchedushim? Schritte ist Schritte. Das wie glanzt. Was für ein mieser Geruch es geht von ihm, wenn atmet. Gewalt. Sein Atem stickt mich. Reb Zalel, steht auf, Gicher, es wird Cholila ein Unglück geschehen. Steht auf. Worum hab ich sich betracht? Ich will dich keulen, Reb Zalel. Rührt sich nicht zu. Es brennt, es schneit, es bricht. Siehst du, wie scharf. Zalel, a lebendiger gehst du von dannen nicht weg. Ich kenn gut Chalochet's Schritte. Seht, Reb Zalel Rappaporter Katakev schreit. Was hast du sich so erschrocken? Was? Du hast Feind zu seinen Almen? Ich will dir bald geben a Get, a Sefer Kritut. Ein Brief schon von Abschneidung. Es ist scharf. Es schneit über in ein Augenblick. Koche meine, Gott will dich nicht herauslassen von dann. Nein, nein, die Schritte kommt. Hakol scheuchtin. Hakol scheuchtin. Heiße Blut gießt und ich schneid. Es ist ein koschere Schritte. Akol Schrutin. Alle mögen keulen. Alle mögen keulen. Oib, euch ist schwer. Oib, es sticht euch und wart bin ich. Nehmt euch alles und schneit. Alle wird werden geringer. Schneit, schneit! Schau! Viele, a scheuchet baleile. Wenn man keulet bei Nacht viele. Oder a blinder keulet. Is euch kosche. Mazel tov, Reb Zalel. Es ist schon noch die Neuen.
armen you. Es ist doch die letzte Nacht in meinem Leben. Oi, saßen you. Mein Kopf, mein Ohrenberg, unglücklicher Kopf.
Thank you, Jake, and Jake and Ethel. It was wonderful. I'm still overwhelmed by the ghosts of the Yiddish coming in. Yeah, I think was it for this selection of texts. I want to thank you again for all the translators, to Irad and Eliana and Ethel and Shiri and Jake. I really, really enjoyed this. I hope we can maybe talk a little bit about this experience. I think we are joined by Maria also, and Evgeny maybe, to moderate the discussion. I will begin maybe with questions to the translators, because I gave them the task to translate, and the idea was that we are also they're going to give feedback of the translation. And I asked them to write footnotes. In this way, it was somehow a manner that I thought in the beginning how to enter these black spaces and kind of discrepancies and between one language and the other, and to think of how Yiddish can start, how these very loaded, charged conversations that have a lot to do with the national language in Israel, with Hebrew or Arabic, how they transform into Yiddish. So it's kind of an open question to either of the translators in the audience, if they wish to comment or say something about their experience of translating.
I guess one thing that was relevant, so my piece I think was the only one translated from Yiddish rather into Yiddish. And so a lot of the sort of challenges and interesting aspects of the process were ones that are very endemic to working from Yiddish. And in the case of this scene, originally a scene from the very end of Yiddishland that I condensed into a monologue. It's a whole bit where she's chasing Reb Salo around with a knife and he's screaming, and
yeah.
So I reduced it to just her. But really what was unique about it is something that comes up very often in translating from Yiddish, which is that even if you're not dealing with religious themes, the Yiddish language is suffused indelibly with Yiddishkeit and with vocabulary and terminology that comes from Jewish religion and culture. And in this case in particular, it's her younger cousin has been studying to be a shoichet, a ritual butcher, and it's his knives that she finds and eventually uses, and it's the inspiration from his studies that she heard from him over and over again because he's a very poor student, took him a long time. And it was kind of challenging because a lot of the language that she uses has very specific religious implications about the nature of these objects and the different processes, mostly the stuff around shechita, about kosher slaughter and the knives, but other things as well. When she's quoting, for example, she references sort of the biblical terminology for a writ of divorce, which in the Yiddish texts, she calls it a brief von Abschneidung, which you could translate as like a letter of separation, but you could also very accurately translate as a letter of amputation. And so trying to figure out how to communicate these things that have these very specific religious and cultural implications in the Yiddish without overloading the English listener with extra language to explain and contextualize is all very often a challenge working from Yiddish, and it was one that I enjoyed and hope I handled well in this case also.
Yeah. I see someone writes that there was a bit of Macbeth in this. Interesting. There was anything in particular in your mind, like a reference when you translated that from a different world of literature?
Well, I hadn't thought about Macbeth, although certainly Macbeth, there's a bit of that there. I don't know. I mean, I think it fits. This is 1899 we're talking about, and the text is very specifically an anti-arranged marriage text. But I'm struggling to think of one example right now. But I mean, Estherke is a character that we get a number of times throughout theatrical history, which is this righteous, vengeful wife exacting revenge on her husband who has mistreated her. And I think like there are so many wonderfully written characters like that throughout the theatrical canon. And in Estherke's case, you know, if you in the immediate moment on Zoom, it's like this is pretty hardcore, but if you had sat through an hour and a half of play and watching how miserable this awful husband had made her, I think it wouldn't be difficult to be on her side. And so I guess I was thinking a lot about that as well, which is like, this is something that would never have occurred as an isolated moment. It's something that it is the climax of a great deal of buildup. So I wanted to make sure it had the weight of an entire narrative that was arriving at this one moment.
Okay, if no other translator wants to share their opinion, I would maybe turn to Sigal here in the audience and ask her if she would like to share something about her experience listening to her poem read in Yiddish.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity, great opportunity. And Ofri, thank you for the initiative and the execution of this evening. Thank you, Shiri, for this great translation to Yiddish. I had sent this poem to one of the Israeli magazines. It was during the riots, the riots in May 2021. And they got the poem and they sent me a letter that they got a poem and they will publish it, of course. And then after 2 days, I got another letter. And then they say that they apologize for this letter, but they would not publish this poem. And it was for a lot of reasons, but it was very, very vague reasons, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And I understood that it was I prefer to call it a silent censorship. And I knew that the reason was political reason. And then I thought that this censorship maybe will increase, even this kind of censorship will increase the violence, because it's not an open censorship. It's not something that you can even confront with. It's something that you don't really understand. And I think that this is one of the reasons that now Israel in such kind of situation, political situation. It made me very sad I must say, this silent censorship. And that's it. But this evening, it's a great pleasure for me to hear this poem in Yiddish, and I think that we must rebuild this kind of censorship. This kind of censorship, not the open censorship. The open censorship is something that you can cope with, but not the silent censorship. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very sorry you had to face, such a unpleasant act of censorship. It's always very heartbreaking for an author, and also, the way it was done, and how it was accepted and then denied. And I think more and more states are kind of using this silent censorship as a tool to silencing authors, and that's disturbing. I wanted to ask Ofri, actually, and maybe some of you guys, of readers and authors and translators. We have Rachel Kafrisen today in the audience, and she actually did the first event, our online event, and she talked a lot about Yiddish spaces and spaces of Yiddish culture in New York. And that gave me also a feeling of, this space is being charged with kind of certain safety and community spirit. And it was very interesting that, Yiddish doesn't only attract people who are Jewish or have, Jewish roots, but also people who are genuinely interested in Yiddish culture and Yiddish language. And Ofri, in the very beginning of our event today, you mentioned this ability and capacity of Yiddish as a safe space. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit? Also maybe from Israeli perspective, because in Israel from the very beginning, Yiddish, was banned and was marginalized, and its position is still, I think, quite shaky in the society. So when you talk about this safe space, how would you, how is this space articulated?
The way I thought about it is that from the commoner Israeli, we think of Yiddish as a language of a specific religious minority, and or either the language of our ancestors, or this kind of closed scholarly realm. And in some ways, for me as an outsider, I don't speak Yiddish myself. I can understand it with the fusion of my knowledge in German and Hebrew, but the idea to reclaim it in a sense, also by saying, obviously there are contemporary Yiddish writers all over that still exercise the language, but I had this intention of reclaiming it as a language that we can still own and express our resistance in the language. And for me, it was a kind of an experiment as well to see what happens if I listen to this kind of texts becoming in Yiddish, how they're going to even sound like, and much more in depth, like what kind of challenges Yiddish has in speaking about topics like the occupation and sexual desire and so on. And I was hoping that with the choice of materials that I chosen today, it will somehow echo from one to another. And I like the idea that certain topics, even though were written in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they're just gonna, and from even Gordon from the beginning of the from 1899, they will kind of echo one to the other, and in that way we can also reflect and think about language as it transforms. And so yeah, this is my feeling, but maybe few of the Yiddish scholars would like to to say more about it, as they know Yiddish as a living much more living scene than I am.
I was hoping to add something about Sigal Naor Perlman's poem, but in this specific context, which is for any Hebrew speaker who reads the poem, it's very obvious that it has an extra layer, which is that it is based upon a story in verse by Leah Goldberg, a very famous Hebrew poet. And this is a story that any child who grew up in Israel and speaks Hebrew knows, and it's about animals thinking about living together in the same building and how to be neighbors. And I was very glad that you asked me to write the footnote, because then I had to look up the history of the story that inspired Sigal's poem, and I saw that it was first published in 1948, which is of course a year that is very meaningful in Israel's history. And then I thought about the melting pot, and this is a poem that is considering how to express the melting pot, or expressing hopes about what this melting pot of Israel is going to be. And of course, Yiddish wasn't really a part of it, or it was almost fully rejected, and makes you wonder, you know, if Yiddish wasn't rejected and all the identities that come with it, could it be a better melting pot for other identities as well? And yeah, so I was just wondering about that, and I didn't know that this was the meaning of this verse, this story in verse in the beginning, because of course I never thought of it again since I was a child. And this also speaks about, you know, Yiddish as a space which can contain multiple identities in this sense.
And translation-wise, how was this experience for you? So you talk about these new meanings and new layers, and did they also come through maybe some linguistic strategies or linguistic approach?
I was hoping to reflect at least that this is based upon a children's poem. I don't know if it reflects as well in Yiddish. And I went back to I wouldn't say the original, but the story that inspired Sigal's poem, and I wanted to see like how it plays with the music and all that. Of course, her rendition of this story is very chilling, to say the least.
Any questions to Ofri and the translators and readers, maybe from our audience? You can also type your questions and comments in the chat if you're shy, or you can ask them directly. Ofri, maybe you can also talk a little bit more about the selection of the text, because when we were just starting, you know, discussing this project, the focus was more on German theater and German censorship. And I think you were very interested also to see how German censorship worked when it came to Yiddish theater, Yiddish texts, Yiddish plays. And then gradually, you know, the focus shifted to Israeli political affairs and Israeli politics and different periods of Israeli political life. So what stimulated this shift? Why did you think it was necessary to go this way?
It's a good question. I think it was just a point of reverse and in my way of working. and it was a little bit putting one against the other. And in a way also quite of an unusual choice to just like flip and decide to bring censored text from my own history in Israel that I knew of into the realm of Yiddish. So I cannot pinpoint exactly the reason, other than that it just fascinated me, the idea of like also bringing the discussion into more also to contemporary side and so on. I think if I had more like in a larger scope, if it was a project of 2 years, I would delve into both of them much more and to start to see relations. But I think it's also interesting to kind of dislocate the conversation from one place to another. Also, that's why I chose still to refer to Jake's translation in the end, because I thought it's interesting to come back to it and create these bridges. So it's not only kind of a local geographical conversation, but it expands. I also thought maybe we could hear from Ethel, because I see there's a question or remark from Ezra in the chat about the translation from Yiddish from Arabic to Yiddish. Maybe it says that Ezra is writing, so fascinating to put Yiddish back into dialogue with Arabic in a reworking of a poem about coexistence and hope from 1948. And thank you for that context. And maybe Ethel would like to say a word about how was it to translate.
Yes.
Yes.
First of all, I think like reading it today was a special experience, looking at the events taking place in Jerusalem and in the country in general, like in the last couple of weeks. I think that for me, one of the main challenges was that while translating from Arabic, I also used the Hebrew version, and I kept noticing how those two were extremely similar. I mean, from the perspective of the grammar of the two languages and the way they work, it was very clear. I could really point on places that were with exactly the same sounds, signifying the same things. For example, the E sound or li, which is kind of like for me, or adds the dimension of having something, which sounds very similar in Hebrew and in Arabic. And in Yiddish, the main challenge for me was to kind of, it was impossible to find places where the languages could sound so similar. So I tried to think like, you know, of other ways that would give sense to my work and make it meaningful to connect the two languages. I think it's very true what people here have pointed out before about a certain way to look at the connection between the two languages might be maybe the history of linguistic oppression that both faced in this country. But on the other hand, like I would also be a little careful with making too swift parallels, because I do feel like the cases are not exactly comparable. I do feel that there are two different grief histories and terminologies for the two languages. But I do believe that Arabic has suffered something more horrible in a way in this region. But I do believe that for me, like even to sit and do this work of translation, I always ask myself, for whom am I translating exactly? It's not the first time I've tried to translate poems between Yiddish and Arabic, mainly Arabic to Yiddish, because the opposite is harder for me. But the question of like who is the target audience is very apparent in this case, I think, because there are very few people who can appreciate both languages at the same time. But I do feel that in Jerusalem, it does open maybe a new kind of space for dialogue. It has to be carefully erected, but I do feel that in this dialogue between the languages, there's a lot of potential.
But would you say that in Israel today, Yiddish is going beyond academic borders? Because I think, you know, it's a language that is studied at the university. You have to have certain particular interest, but does it also expand its space in Israel, or we can't really talk about that yet?
Well, I think first of all, we have a huge community of people who are actual Hasidic native speakers, which is also something that shouldn't be ignored, except for the more academic context. And I think in those spaces, there's a lot that I don't even know that much about, because the activity is on a parallel area that the more academic Yiddish speakers are not always familiar with. But I do know for a fact that even in Jerusalem, there's many people who are either coming out of the ultra-Orthodox community or somewhere in the gray area between being inside or outside, and they are also sometimes advocating for the language, even speaking it with their children once they already leave the community, which is something that I don't think we hear a lot about. Not that we hear so much about Yiddish-speaking children in general, but I do feel that in Jerusalem there are new things going on with Yiddish. Also in Tel Aviv, I think more younger people are realizing that it's a language that enables them to, as it has been said before, connect to their Jewish past and roots while choosing an alternative path to what the hegemonic Zionist narrative proposes. But I do think that people here are maybe it's less self-understood for them to make such a choice here, because in Israel, except for the entire oppression history that Yiddish has faced, there's also just the factor of Yiddish being very strongly associated with elderly people, or all kinds of like specific sentiments that are sometimes on the verge of like very, very kitschy notions. And for that reason, I think for many young people, it makes it kind of harder to connect to it, because there's kind of this stigma of it being extremely uncool. But I do think that it's a process. And I do also think that now in our times, when such frequent dialogue is possible because of platforms in the electronic world, much more people here are witnessing the, I don't know, I don't want to call it renaissance or revival, because there's always some Yiddish renaissance somewhere, but many young people here are witnessing what's happening in the United States, for example, with Yiddish, and in big cities in Europe, and they are becoming more engaged. So hopefully we just have to continue, and more young people will join.
That's great to hear. I wanted to ask all of the translators whether you guys have been in touch while translating. Was it a collective, maybe somehow experience, or was it purely individual? Because I assume there might be situations when you would need maybe an advice or maybe a consultation with each other. Were you in this collective discussion or not during the process of working on the text?
Maybe I'll start by saying that they worked individually, and I don't know what, like in terms of not connecting with another, maybe they had other advisors. But the idea for me was, as a continuation, also to think of a way to interlace feedbacks afterward, after the text is done, to create like a meta-narrative between the translators. And this didn't happen for this event, but it could be a certain continuation of it, most likely.
I think it will be good to reflect on that. There's a lot of maybe things to discuss afterwards. We have a question from Ileana, who has problems with her microphone, unfortunately. So she's asking, if Ofri would be interested to set this project into context alongside the current censorship of theater in Germany, based on exaggerated or false accusation of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's also very interesting, because it's a very hard debate, and I thought maybe it will even touch us in some ways, because there's a feeling that there's certain organizations that are scouting for any kind of events, also in Germany, that are that in some ways are associated with the left, and they, because on the grounds of perhaps being like tagged as anti-Semitic, but there's a kind of a governmental advice, or I don't know how to translate it exactly, but not a law, but advised for anyone who is associated with the BDS movement to be not like they're taking the budgets all away from them. So it's an interesting thought. I didn't have any intention to do it in this point, but I will definitely think about it. And I mean, I don't know if we can escape the targeting by moving completely into Yiddish, but it could happen.
Speaking as someone who lives in Berlin, although I'm not there at the moment, yeah, there's a huge amount of self-censorship going on right now in Germany, specifically among Jews, and it's like it has a chilling effect on everything, and you know, there's a huge irony to non-Jewish Germans telling Jews that they're anti-Semitic, and it happens all the time. I'm going to self-censor myself by not saying any more about that. But I did have a comment. Well, I had a couple of comments on what's been said before. One is that there's a book about Palestinian Yiddish, which just was digitized, and I highly recommend looking it up for anyone who's interested, because Yiddish in Palestine, going back to the Ottoman era, had a lot of Arabic in it. I'm not an expert on this at all, but there's a lot of really interesting examples of how there were Arabic words similar to the way that there are Slavic words in Eastern European Yiddish. And for me, reading my section, which I did not translate, I found it really interesting that we've taken someone who, in some ways, was like, you know, born in I guess it was before Israeli, the state of Israel existed, but he was your classic Sabra, but he changed his name, and he was really kind of representative of this idea of Israeli nativeness. You know, he was a member of the Canaanite movement at one point, and so I think it's really interesting to take someone who Israelified their name or Hebraized their name and then put them back into Yiddish. It's kind of an erasure of the erasure.
Thank you. And the title of the book about Palestinian Yiddish, is there a title that we can just write down, or?
The title is Palestinian Yiddish.
Okay. Thank you, Jake. Yeah, we actually, you know, about the erasure of erasure and the self-censorship, and we had a discussion about, you know, Jews in Germany and current positions in Jews and what Jews are wanted by Germany at the moment in one of our events, and it was also, of course, largely influenced by what happened in Documenta and how it shifted the entire focus, you know, from the artistic approach of one group to kind of, you know, the anti-Semitic whatever agenda, and that was very sad, I think, to to see how the entire conversation and dialogue about that shifted and kind of went to a very wrong direction. Interesting also to see the development, I think, of this discourse in Germany and how that can be changed also on the state level, because so far it has just seemed to be growing in a very disturbing kind of way. So I wonder what could make this shift happen, and how the Jewish community could also maybe respond to this very narrow-minded discourse. Are there any thoughts on that? Maybe among artists who are living in Germany? As far as I understand, Jake is based there, and Eliana as well, who can maybe type her thoughts in the chat since her microphone is off. Or maybe
Actually,
Jake.
I can. Or,
You can
sorry,
speak.
I
Great.
Yeah, now that the music is off. Yes, the Yiddish community in Germany is working very hard against exactly this. And I would say that we're forming like quite a community of solidarity that hopefully will provide an alternate like image of Judaism to non-Jews in Germany, because a lot of non-Jews equate Jews with Israel and anything to do with Israel. And very gladly, as somebody already mentioned, Germans love calling Jews anti-Semitic. That's like a passion of Germans. And so so we're hoping, like, as the Yiddish artistic community in Germany, to form an alternate view, but we don't really have, or sorry, an alternate community that also is given a microphone. Thankfully, Ellen Byrne, who's the director of Yiddish Summer Weimar, which is the biggest Yiddish festival, I think, in Europe, has just gotten the Bundesverdienstkreuz. And next week, I'm going to be introducing him to Bonaventure Nedikung, who is the upcoming director of the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and Bonaventure has received accusations of anti-Semitism in recent months, ever since his new position has been announced. So I'm personally hoping to bridge a gap in that case, a community, in order to save Bonaventure from being pulled under as an accused anti-Semite, and to bring the Yiddish community more into this area of like neutrality, welcomeness, as Ofri mentioned, a safe space, so that everybody is welcome. So yes, this is, that's the current standing from my position as an artist in Germany, but maybe somebody else has a different position.
That's really amazing, and good luck with making this bridging. I think it's very crucial and very, very important. So if you can somehow keep us posted on your further actions in that regard, we would very much appreciate that.
Certainly.
Okay, maybe.
Maybe I can, like, I translated the part about Hanoch Levin, and I wanted to say, like, also living in Germany, living in Berlin, I can, just only agree with what's been said before, and I see how, like, the concept of silent censorship brought up by Sigal, and self-censorship concept brought by Jack, they're kind of coming together, and like, when you live in Berlin as a Jew or as a non-Jew, you kind of like know yourself, like what you should say, what you should not say, like, you know, what, like when you apply to something as an artist and as academic, you kind of know what are your limits, and it's a problem, and it's there. And I wanted to recommend like a group or like a like meeting of some people that take part lately. It's called the Diaspora Alliance. So it's like a group, like we had already 2 meetings of like different artists and academics, Jewish and friends in Berlin, and exactly talking about these things. Yeah, also about censorship in this context. And also, I wanted to talk about like a different thing that we were talking about earlier, about my process of translation, or like my experience of translating this like parts by Hanoch Levin. I wanted to say it was very interesting, like kind of like fun to do it, because it's kind of like brought like 2 different parts of my brain, of my personality together, which are like both very, very present, because like I grew up in Israel, but I spent my professional life like 100 years ago in Yiddish, and suddenly like finding words in Yiddish to describe like reality that I grew up with, and like specifically in this shtick, this environment of like suspecting each other and being suspected, and like living this like it's something very Israeli, not only in the besetzte Gebiete, like what I read, but it's a very what I read like really and translated, it really reflects like a basic feeling that I knew from this place, also from Tel Aviv, not just in anywhere in Israel. Anyway, so finding words in Yiddish to describe it, like kind of like brought different parts of me together, and like kind of brought Yiddish for me like back to life, and like suddenly the Yiddish was looking at the reality that I've been living in, and it was like an interesting thing. And also Ethel was brought up before, like the question of to whom do we write, to whom do we translate, who is to whom do we do it? Because even like the Hasidim, Haredim in Mea Shearim in Brooklyn who speak Yiddish, like many of them, like the one in Israel, they do speak Hebrew as well, or maybe even better Hebrew than Yiddish. So it is, of course, in the end of the day, what we do is very symbolic. Like the target audience that we have is like each other, and like the future, or like eternity, or maybe in my head it was sometimes my target or like invisible target audience was writers that I read, writers that used to live 100 years ago or more, like in a way, like I was having them in front of my face when I was trying to find words that they would use to translate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rand, for your comment. Yeah, I was actually wondering, I'm sorry I didn't ask this question earlier, but also your piece is also very very political and deals very strongly with Israeli political processes. So I think it was also challenging and interesting to turn that into Yiddish, because it's not an obvious direction of translation. So I think in that respect that was quite a unique experience, linguistically as well.
And I think that in a way it's not so far away from the Yiddish reality of 100 years ago, because what I read was about like the feeling of walking in the street and being like suspected. Doesn't matter what you do. If you look up, if you look down, if you don't look, if you're not, I mean, it doesn't matter what you do, you are suspected. And something can happen to you at any moment because of that. And I think that this was like the very basic everyday experience of Jewish people, of Yiddish-speaking people 100 years ago in Central and Eastern Europe. So in a way, when I think about it, it's kind of all connected. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's echoing. Yeah. Okay, so I think it's time for us to maybe wrap up, and I wanted to ask maybe Ofri on some last reflections about the session, because I also wanted you to maybe speak a little bit about your method, about an orchestrated reading, and maybe tell a little bit about what they are, because I think we've seen a beautiful experience and experiment of collective work that has been beautifully executed, and we've seen a constellation of very different voices and minds, and everyone has contributed so largely to this session, and the preparation process has been, I think, very, on the one hand, demanding, but also self-reflective to a large extent. So I wanted you, Ofri, to share some thoughts on how this method works and how this session for you has been in general.
Yeah, I must say it's been really, really wonderful and really, really exciting. And it's even hearing all the feedback and the new ideas and things that it's evoking makes me reflect, obviously, even more. So I think I'm myself I'm overwhelmed by how actual it is to my reality more than I thought, and to our reality. For me, I mean, as a practice, it started by the fact that once years ago I was invited to speak about my research for my PhD, and I'm a shy speaker, so I wrote my lecture and I handed it to all the audience and asked them to read it with me. So this kind of initiated the idea that I need any kind of position to be read multivocally, multi-participatory, to have all this, the audience become part of the work. So I never really, and that started like a sort of a practice that I developed of having text actually created by participation, and then also shared through participation. So this is still evolving, and there's like the idea of having it in Zoom was very challenging for me, because usually in a space you can do much more, and I didn't want to stretch the limits of Zoom too much, because for me it begins to be very chaotic. So and also we are very late in fashion now with Zoom. I just decided to have it straightforward and just let people read it as if we were like now in a certain situation of a shared reading in a coffee house or whatever. So this is the way I've been working, and I hope to perhaps reflect on it more, create it more, have it even more complex, or change avenues. But it was completely exciting to me. And there's a reader that is available for anyone who would like to read or pass on and read the translations again. And it's online on the page of the program.
Yeah, and now I'm going to put the link in the chat once again.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Maybe somebody else would like to say some concluding words. Zhenya, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you so much, Ofri, and all the speakers, presenters, translators today. I was very excited about this project, and it's one of the highlights of the Yiddishland Pavilion 2022 for sure, because of complexity and the multiplicity of languages and context, historical, geographical. So I want to, so today is the last event of the Yiddishland Pavilion 2022, and it was a project that Maria and I have been working for 3 years at least. And so I want to thank everyone all the people who have attended our events in Venice in April, but also online since since May, and we are planning to do one more at least Yiddishland Pavilion, and we'll see what happens in 2 years. But we'll start plotting soon. So I want to thank everyone. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for all the readers and translators. I really enjoyed you having been here.
Yeah, that was a great performance, and even some props have been used, which I very much appreciated.
So it was great.
Thank you guys very, very much. And I hope the project will evolve. I hope that today we just saw the first iteration of this, important combination of, how to talk about language, about censorship, about silencing, about voicing and enhancing certain voices. So good luck if you decide to continue, and I hope you do. And yes, I also thank all the participants of Yiddishland Pavilion this year, and some of them were with us tonight, even though they stayed silent. I know who you were. Thanks again very much, and we very much hope to be back in 2024 in Venice and beyond. Thank you.